我们继续回来访问香港科技大学的贝斯图教授。I'd like to begin this session with China's policy on lifting the ban on single child. And I think this is out of China's concern about economic growth. They don't have enough demographic factor in order to support this kind of growth. But is this lifting of ban and letting couple to have two child, is it really working in a sense for China, or what's went wrong with it?
So I think that many people are surprised that it didn't have such a major impact.
Right.
That the number of births that have resulted is I think much less than many expected. And part of that is related to the kind of the expectations that the birth control restrictions were kind of holding back fertility. And then if we lift them, then people just want to have more children and they will just proceed to do so. But I think that kind of misunderstood the context of, firstly it misunderstood the context of the past policy.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the case that the whole country was only allowed to have one child, then now everyone can have two. There were many different restrictions and different allowances in the past for different groups of people to have more than one child. So it wasn't such a dramatic change as I think that we globally it was presenting. But the second thing is that it misunderstood, I think, the context of childbearing in China. That living in China, and particularly living in urban China, the environment for having children is not that different to the environment to having children in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Singapore, in Hong Kong. Even though the income levels might be lower, the context is kind of similar. And of course, all of those places there didn't have a one-child policy, didn't have any birth control restrictions. And we're seeing very low fertility. And because the reasons behind very low fertility in mainland China are the same reasons we would see here. That the cost of housing is very high. Incomes are kind of fragile. Jobs are fragile. The cost of education and childcare, the impact upon careers, particularly for women. All of these issues are kind of similar. Filial piety, the idea of having to, looking after your parents, so parental obligations, care obligations, all of these things. So it goes back to this idea of solving a demographic problem with find a demographic solution to a demographic problem. China is now seeing that very clearly because the root issues behind low fertility are not being addressed by that. Now, increasingly, I think they will be. There will be more policies to support families and support childbearing, particularly kindergartens. We can see new policies for that. But until that happens, I would expect fertility to stay fairly low.
My question regarding to this is more general one. You just said that China is not really effective when they lift the ban on having two children. But my question is more like, when government is using family planning or demographic policy in trying to influence the individual choices, are they going to be effective? I mean, to what degree should the government is holding back and not to interfere with individual choices, or is it had to forcibly enforce like the family planning they have in China? Like there's very enforcement that had created a lot of tragedy for killing the newborn or anything like that. But my question is, how do we define the line that the government should not be crossing in this policy?
So I think that, well, firstly, I'll just to leave China for a moment, because China is in terms of population policy and family planning policy kind of an outlier, right? As being much stronger than anywhere else in the world. But if we look at either family policies that have brought down fertility, so family planning policies, but also today policies that aim to increase fertility,
right.
right? I would argue that these policies and what private sector as well would do, they should always be aligned with what people themselves want. Mm-hmm. And that's how they become successful. Mm-hmm. Family planning policies in Taiwan, for example, right? Taiwan had some of the most successful family planning policies in the world. And part of the reason why these family planning policies were successful was, yes, because they were good policies, they were comprehensive policies. It wasn't just about handing out contraception, right. Education, right. Information, health concerns were addressed and so on. But also, it was aligned with what individuals wanted. People wanted to have fewer children. Mm-hmm. And people wanted to have fewer children because of urbanization, because of industrialization, because of economic change, right? So the policies worked because they were based upon individual aspirations. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there's a fine line to say that were these family planning policies brought in because individuals wanted to have lower fertility? No, they were brought in because of a government target, right? So there is this kind of fine line between supporting people to do what they want to do, but then also kind of imposing upon them something which the government wants them to do as well. Right. Now, I would argue that when we look at policies to increase fertility today, I think we could almost see the same framework. Mm-hmm. That one of the reasons why these policies to increase fertility are not really working is because they're not aligned to what people's day-to-day lives, people's day-to-day existence. So just encouraging people to have more children, through financial transfers or through kind of propaganda or whatever you would call it, is not necessarily going to work because you've not addressed the root cause.
Take the case of Singapore, for instance. Singapore, they seem to have a policy, I may be wrong, that they want to encourage the college couple to have more children instead of the girl who don't have college educations. And then they are using this way somehow to promote or do their family planning. Is it true or is it working?
So that was certainly the case in the past, that there was different ideas about who should and shouldn't have more, who should get more or less support. Whereas these days, I think that there's a more kind of general approach to just trying to increase fertility more generally. But it raised an interesting point that, again, when we look at the history of family planning and also even looking at trying to increase fertility, there is always been a link back to policies which, or to to ideologies which we might not necessarily feel comfortable talking about, about who should be the right people to have more children, who should we encourage to have fewer children, and that's a part of our history, and we need to be honest and open about that. That some of the policies that were brought in the 20th century were what today we would find to be unacceptable, and we need to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again, and we learn from our mistakes and our experiences in the 20th century, and not to make those mistakes today. But again, I think part of this as well is linking back to ideology. Is why are we so worried that the population might go below 20 million, might fall from 23 million in Taiwan? Well, part of that can be a conservative view about the strength of the country, and we attach the strength of the country to its population. It's a kind of biblical view, like the tribe needs to be very big in order to be powerful. But then you can say, well, then why does the number of people affect how strong a country is? If you take say a country like Uganda, which maybe has a population 10 times the size of Taiwan, but it's not 10 times more powerful in the world stage. It doesn't have a 10 times more powerful army. It's not so we have to be slightly wary of this nationalist discourse, I think, around total population size.
My final question is also regarding with the ideology. Sometimes when the government want to promote family planning, they always attach marriage and family they think it's the building block for this whole population policy. And now we are seeing all around the world, people have different thinking about quote-unquote marriage. They have same-sex marriage, they have single parenthood. What do you think about this population, and then with this so-called stable system of marriage and family?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways you can approach this. The first would be to be a passive view, which is to say, well, look, if we look all around the world, this is something which is just changing.
Right.
That all countries with low fertility, particularly in Europe, North America, even Latin America, are moving away from this model of marriage, pregnancy, childbearing. Right? There's many different family forms, and so it's going to happen anyway. So we're going to have to accept it. Right? So that's a passive view. Or you can take a more active view and to say, well, actually, if a child is born within a same-sex couple, right, this child is still a citizen of Taiwan. This child is going to go on to go to school and to work and to pay tax. So it's in our best interest for that child to have the best life possible. This child is a citizen of Taiwan in exactly the same way that a child of a traditional heterosexual married couple would be. And so rather than just kind of accepting this as okay, we've just got to deal with this, then maybe it's something that we can be active and embrace, and to actually say, well, people's relationship, people fall in love in all kinds of different ways and have different relationships, and also recognizing that sometimes in life things don't work out right. Maybe you want to be a single parent, but it may well be that you just end up being a single parent. So why should you be penalized for being a single parent? And more importantly, why should your child be penalized for you being a single parent? Right? Similarly, if you're a woman and you fall in love with a woman, why should you necessarily be penalized by the state? And more importantly, why should your child be penalized by the state for that? And particularly when we move into this era of very low fertility, the state can't afford to penalize children like that. We need to make the most of all of our human capital.
So the state should find out whatever means it can to support all kinds of ways or marriage that it can support a child or give a birth to a child, in the sense.
I would say so, yeah.
Thank you very much, Stuart, to be on our show and talking about this very important issue. Although it's not really a national security issue, but it's really a very serious issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
也谢谢各位观众的收看，我们下次见。